Welcome to the Supercut of the 2024 hashtag Breakdown Quilt Along, where I outline step by step how I break down quilting for efficient and organized project management. This Supercut is all the videos cut together into a single resource. I hope you find the process helpful. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. Now let's get to the good stuff. Hi guys, I am thrilled that you're joining me for the Breakdown Quilt Along. Today I am walking you through my personal approach to breaking down a quilt pattern and streamlining the process for a smooth journey and efficient sewing. The key to streamlining my process is keeping decision-making and design process separate from execution. The reason I do this is because these actions use different parts of the brain. So I try to do all of my thinking up front, and then I can run on autopilot for the rest of the steps. I'll highlight the areas that I think about and then walk through the specific decisions I've made for this particular remixed geese pattern. There's a ton of information here, but I'll make it easy, I promise. The first thing you want to do is read through your pattern. Skim through your pattern. I want to know the basics of how the designer, in this case Erica Jackman, gets to the end result. And the first thing I look at is technique. With technique, I always make sure to understand the technique or methods up front. It's like a road map, and knowing the twists and turns before I hit the road ensures a smoother journey. You know, are there any techniques that I find particularly interesting or challenging? Is there a specialty ruler that I need to purchase or learn to use? Am I even going to use the same technique outlined in the pattern? If I'm not, it may change my fabric requirements, which is why I begin with technique and not with fabric requirements. For instance, there are a dozen ways to execute half square triangles. Am I using their way or my favorite way? Are there any steps I can streamline or batch to make it quicker or easier for how my brain works? My viewpoint is don't reinvent the wheel unless there's a really good reason. If the pattern is full of half square triangles and makes them by drawing that line on the back and sewing on both sides, but I prefer using triangle paper, I'll probably use the triangle paper. It's my quilt and I'm making it, so unless I'm looking to learn something specific, I'm going to use whatever method is most efficient. If there is a good reason to use the technique outlined in the pattern, like fabric conservation or construction concerns, then I need to know that now, which is why I skim through and look at how it all comes together. Some things can easily be changed without consequences, but some things can't, and I need to know that now. Directional fabric is often one to watch out for. Number 2, materials. On to materials. Checking the fabric requirements early on is normal. It's where we usually begin. We flip that pattern over and say, oh, it needs 12 fat quarters and 2 yards of background, or a layer cake and a yard and a half of background, or whatever it is. And those are good general things to know, but the reason I start with technique is because maybe I want to use a cut of fabric that doesn't work with the outline technique or the instructions. I need to know how to integrate my methods and my materials with the pattern. We'll go back to that half square triangle idea. Let's say the pattern is written for strips and the easy angle ruler, but I don't have an easy angle ruler, or I love this specific charm pack and want to use it instead. Because I read through the techniques first, I already know that I need a different half square triangle method to arrive at the same results. But I like triangle paper anyway, so there, problem solved. The point is to think about this and decide before cutting anything and gathering materials, because it changes the steps and directions and potentially other fabric requirements. And don't forget backing. What about backing? Do I have the required yardage? Am I piecing something together? Do I want to make a few extra blocks to add some interest to the back? Do I need to order a wide backing fabric so that it's arrived and ready when the top is ready? And how will I bind this quilt? Also, how will I label this quilt? I could do a whole video on labeling quilts, and I would need to take my own advice. Whether I stick to the pattern suggestions or put a unique spin on it to use what I have or what I really like, now at the beginning is the time to decide. Number 3, that's 3, not that. 3, color, the fun part. Am I following the pattern's color recommendations, or do I have my own vibrant palette in mind? Maybe I want a 2-color quilt. Do I have a pre-cut bundle to use, or am I using scraps? Any of these choices might require me to alter techniques or fabric requirements depending on how the pattern is written. See, it's all tied together. But having gone through the technique decisions and the materials thought process gives me the information I need to pull fabrics from my stash or from the store and begin making color choices. Number 4, construction and layout. Understanding how the pieces come together is key. It's like having the picture of the jigsaw puzzle in your mind before you even start. Can I identify any potential tricky spots in the construction process? Am I considering other layout variations? These choices don't need to necessarily be finalized right now, but they can give me insight on how to go about the piecing and block construction process. Sometimes it really matters. For instance, if I want an ombre or color shift effect, I need to know the construction and layout plan beforehand because it dictates how the blocks are pieced together. It might also dictate changes in my fabric requirements or color choices. It's all tied together. If I'm working entirely randomly, this may not matter, but that's why I think about it right now. Decide if it matters and how, or if it doesn't. I'll also look at how the quilt is assembled and determine if that works for me or if there's another option that's easier. Many quilts are join the blocks for the rows, then sew the long rows together. I personally hate that. I just hate it. So I look at it and see if there's a different way. Can I web the top, Bonnie Hunter style? I'll link that below. Or can I chunk it up the way Pat Sloan often does? Regardless of how I'm actually going to do it, thinking about it now saves me time later because I have a plan, and when the time comes, I can just execute. Remember, separating decision making and execution is my secret sauce for efficient quilting. It's like setting the stage, so when I cut and sew, it's running on autopilot. Number 5, quilting and finishing. How frustrating are those words I always see at the end of the pattern, like an afterthought, quilt as desired. Well, duh, but what do I desire? Thinking about the quilting from the get-go can alleviate a great deal of stress and help get a quilt finished faster. It doesn't get stuck in limbo waiting for a decision because the decision, or at least a direction, is already made. Quilt as desired treats the quilting as an afterthought, and in my world, that is a road directly to UFO land. Do not pass go, do not collect $200. When I think about the quilting and backing and binding actually, during this part of the process, it becomes part of the plan and flows through to the finished quilt at least more easily. So, think loosely about the quilting now. Some things that will help you. What is the purpose of the quilt? Is it for cuddling or a baby or show? Are there areas of the design that lend themselves to feature quilting? Would it look great with geometrics or straight lines? Does it have really tiny pieces that need denser quilting? What sort of quilting do you prefer? And what color thread might look nice? These are the things that I might not be able to answer all of these questions and make final decisions right now. My cat, sorry. But the answers to these questions give me direction and a general plan about the quilting and help the project not end up in UFO land. Frankly, when I get the top finished, my brain has already moved on to the next project, so having these decisions at least mapped out a little makes a huge difference. Okay, that's a ton of information I just threw at you. There's a link down below to a PDF with a brief recap, but let's walk through what I did for the remixed geese pattern specifically. Technique. Remixed Geese uses the 4 at a time method to make the flying geese units, and this is a great method. It's quick, it makes efficient use of fabric, but I'm not using it. Instead, I'm using my AccuQuilt cutting system. I have the 3.5 by 6.5 flying geese die, but I'm not using that either. I know, hang on. I am using die number, I don't know, 4 and 5 from the 12-inch cube system. 1, because I have it, but mostly, number 2, because I have 10-inch squares and they'll work with these 2 dies. But you should choose the method that you prefer. If you're making the geese pattern and you love the Eleanor Burns method, use it. Look at how it might change your cutting instructions or fabric requirements. Make notes on your pattern and go for it. If you prefer flip and sew, make those notes and go for it. If you're using the flying geese die, adjust for that. The point is to think about it and decide now. Next, materials choices. Look at your pattern, this one or whatever you're using, and make sure you have what you need fabric-wise. I have 10-inch squares. I have an abundance of 10-inch squares that I cut. I have them, I have a way that makes efficient use of them, so that's what I'm using. Now color, the fun part. Most of what drew me to this pattern is the vibrant, kind of chaotic, cheery color palette. So I'm using bright, happy, chaotic colors as well. I looked at the pattern picture and made a mental and actual note, you can see here, of what I liked. I like the mix of high and low contrast color combinations. I love the vivid, clear colors, and I love how the values often switch places. I like that dynamic energy, so I pulled colors to get the same feel. I mean, mine's not gonna match. I know they have like a list of what fabrics they used. Mine's not gonna match, but it's gonna give it the same feel. If you don't like the frenetic energy of the sample or want to calm it down, you consider that in your color choices. Maybe you want it all pinks, or all pinks and greens, with an occasional pop of chartreuse. Maybe you want to sketch it out and play with some color combos. If you're an EQ8 user, that's Electric Quilt 8, it's a design software program, draft it in there and play with the colors for days. The point is to make a plan and pull your colors now, prepped and laid out. If you're not entirely color confident, here is a great place to use that selvage technique that I showed in the Color Hacks video. I'll link that in the cards and down below. Grab that super bright, colorful fabric that you love and look at its selvage screen sequence. It'll give you a place to start. If you're using a bundle, do you need to pull in some feature colors or accents from your scraps or stash to help punch it up and make it more dynamic? Do you want a specific color running through the entire piece to give it a bit of calmness or unity? Do you want a rainbow or ombre effect where it runs from light to dark? Whatever color choices you make, now is when you decide. After the video, hang with me, there are 2 more steps. So before we get all giddy playing with color, there's more to think about, beginning with construction and layout. For me, my colors are completely random and don't need to be put together in any certain order, so my color placement decisions will be deferred to when I lay out the blocks on a design wall later. I'll give you more tips on getting through that when we get there. If you choose a rainbow effect, for example, your color order and construction decisions need to be more detailed and thought about right now. This pattern has the blocks constructed as a 2 geese unit, which works great for me, and then it lays them out in rows and joins the rows, which doesn't work great for me, so I marked up my pattern. You probably wondered what all those scribbles were. I marked up my pattern in such a way that I have 9 patches for most of the quilt. I mean, this bottom row is a little, where am I? This bottom row is a little different. And look, you can see my notes. I write all over it. I'll write in my books too. Now, don't write in a library book or someone else's book, but I absolutely make notes. And if you don't feel comfortable writing in your book, stick a Post-it note in there and write on that. But I broke mine up into where it's mostly 9 patches. And that bottom row is a little different, but I know that now, which means I don't have to think about it later. This way I can deal with smaller, more manageable chunks, easier to maneuver, easier for pressing, which makes it easier on my body, which is very important. You have to decide what makes it easy for you. One final step, quilting and finishing. These are loose thoughts about the quilting that sort of just hang out in the back of my mind, direction rather than final decision. I know this quilt is for cuddling. It's not for a show. So I think with my quilt being so busy with color that I probably want something simple, non-distracting, all over meander or loopy design. But I also know I'll finalize that decision once I see the whole piece. The quilting decisions vary with the quilt's intended use, the construction, the consultation of my long armor, and my time and budget constraints. Regardless, it's always just, like I say, floating in the back of my mind, and it's not that critical for this quilt right now. I know I'll bind this quilt with my signature red and white polka dot, and I know I already have miles of 2.5 strips cut, so that's super easy. Backing was a little harder. I'm not buying anything right now, so I know I want to use what I have, and I have a fabric that will need to be pieced more specifically because it's a border type design. And once I see the final size of the quilt, I can make that decision. But I know what I'm using and what is required, so when the time comes, the plan is already in place. And this is huge for me. I need the plan to be in place so that I can just go to it and not have to think about it, because if I have to think about it, it's automatically in UFO land. That's the process. I read through the pattern and chose my technique of using the AccuQuilt dies in 10-inch squares. I decided what color feel I wanted, and I pulled my 10-inch squares. I made a construction plan, and I know how to get there. I have a quilting idea and direction. I have my binding. I have my backing plan. Crap, label. I need a plan for a label. See, this is why I do this. This is why I do this up front. Okay, make a note. Where'd my pencil go? Okay, label. Extra block. Okay, I'll make an extra block with light centers, write the info on it with my fabric pen. Now I have a label plan. These are all the choices that you already make for every quilting project that you do. I just front load them and think about them all at one time so that I don't have to think about them again. Like I say, thinking and decision making are different areas of the brain than execution and action. The less time I spend switching modes, so to speak, the faster I can work and the less fatiguing it is. I have a plan, and now I can execute on that plan. So what now? Well, now it's your turn. Now you make all these decisions for your own quilt, be it the Remix Geese pattern or some other pattern. This week, go through the steps. There's a PDF linked below. Make your notes and pull your colors. Play with the colors until they make you happy. Gather any tools you need for the quilt. Maybe choose your piecing thread. Think about how it will all come together and what's going to work for you. Find your backing and binding fabric, or at least think about them and make some notes about ideas or a plan. Think about the quilting and what direction you want to go. And don't forget that label. Think about that and make a plan ahead for it as well. I should really refer to my own PDF. For me, the decision-making phase is the most involved part of quilt making, which is why I try to do as much of it at the start as possible. Also, guys, don't get too hung up on it. This is a process that I've developed and practiced over a long time. And, y'all, it's quilting. It's quilting. It's not that serious. In the end, this is what works for me, and you will find what works for you. So be kind to yourself as you try a new process. Quilt kits, everything you need in one convenient package at a premium price for a quilt that's going to look like every other quilt made from said kit. They are convenient, and I know the work of planning and cutting takes effort and costs money. What if we did it ourselves? What if we have all the convenience of a kit made with fabrics we already know we love for the cost of just a bit of our own time? Hi, I'm Amy and I make things. And in today's video, I'm making my own kits and showing you how to get the convenience of a quilt store right from your own stash. Hang around, let's see how it goes. Last week we talked about the decision process. I pulled my colors. Now what? Now comes what I call cutting and kitting. Purchased kits come in basically two varieties. The kits like this one that I bought on sale during that Fat Quarter Shop December sale days. The dang smileys hit me right in the nostalgia. But you get the pattern and the fabric you need and you go from there. And pre-cut kits like this one. This is the Alaska kit from Laundry Basket Quilts, where everything is pre-cut and all you have to do is sew. This is more the type that I want to talk about today. When I prep kits, I do all the decision making and fabric pull that we talked about last week, and then I try to get myself as close to a pre-cut, ready to sew kit as possible. Using the AccuQuilt system makes this easier, and we'll talk more about AccuQuilt in a bit, but even when not using it, I aim for a ready to sew state. I batch as many tasks as possible, and I cut everything for a quilt all at one time. In fact, I try to cut and prep for several quilts at a time. This allows me to work quickly, but also ensures that I have something to work on for times when I just want to sew fabric together, not make a bunch of decisions or make a mess pulling fabrics out or looking for patterns. Having kits ready to sew makes it easy to just go sew. The bigger reason I do this is so that I can do all of one type of action at the same time for multiple projects. If I'm already in the fabric bins or drawers, it doesn't take much more effort to pull for 2 or 3 projects rather than just one. The same applies to cutting, prepping, trimming blocks, etc. You get it. If I can stay in one mode for many projects, I can move faster, and that's important to me. It's also important that it saves me time and energy with cleanup, resetting, lifting equipment or moving things, especially if you have to work in a very small space or you have to set up and put away your sewing machine every time you work. It's also great for retreat packing. So here's what I did for remixed geese. It's super simple as all the blocks are exactly the same. I'm using the AccuQuilt 12-inch cube dies, number 4 and 5, and 10-inch squares. Since I need 4 geese units of each pair of colors, I did it like this. Okay, here I'm testing the grain line. It's important that you feed your fabric through the AccuQuilt machine along the lengthwise grain so that your pieces don't get distorted by the very slight compression as it goes through the rollers. I cut the half square triangles for the wing pieces of the geese, and then I position my main body, the main triangle of the geese, on the other quarter square triangle board. And you'll see me, I cut all of the wing pieces for 6 units, 6 colors, 6 pairs of colors, because I can feed 6 layers of fabric through my AccuQuilt machine, and I stack those 6 colors up on the quarter square triangle board, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then run those through. And you'll see here in a minute, I start it, and then I put my left hand in what they call the no-no zone, which is the part you're not supposed to touch, and so it backed itself out. I just ran it through the other way. Sometimes that works, sometimes it messes them up. This time it worked. So now I've got all my pieces together, and in just a few minutes, I've got 24 geese units completely ready to go. If you are using the 4 at a time method outlined on the pattern, this is where you'd cut all your squares, draw your lines, and keep them all together ready for the sewing step. Let's talk about the AccuQuilt for a minute. The number one thing I get asked is, isn't there a lot of fabric waste? Yes and no. There is a bit less efficient fabric usage, meaning I'm creating more small scraps that need to be cut down later. But as far as actual waste, like the bits I throw away, it's about the same as cutting bigger and trimming down. I know we've all seen people, throw fabric across the die and cut from the middle, but that is not how most people actually work with fabric. The same way most of us wouldn't cut from the center of a fat quarter without, really good reason. And here's the thing, there's going to be some waste. There's some waste with rotary cutting as well. But as an accessibility tool, the waste, or rather scrap generation, is a trade-off for me being able to continue quilting at all, let alone at the pace that I want to. I try to make the most efficient use of the fabric as possible, and I call it good. Here's what I had left from cutting all the geese units. These little strips from the half square triangles, which will go in my pile of cut to 1.5 inch squares, and then these chunkier bits from the quarter square triangles, the center of the geese, that I'll cut into strips or strings or 2.5 inch blocks. And the thing is, it took me about 50 minutes to cut over 200 flying geese units, and that's the magic of the AccuQuilt. There's no way on my hip I could have stood and cut all these geese units at all, let alone in under an hour. The AccuQuilt as an accessibility tool is what allows me to quilt. It's what's allowed me to participate in the Indigo Way Mystery Quilt-Along. I used my 6-inch cube to cut all these tiny pieces for units. Now I just put all these geese pieces on my tray, and I'm ready to sew. If I'm kitting up lots of things, I use Ziploc bags. Sometimes Ziploc bags inside Ziploc bags. I like the 2-gallon size for everything, and I put everything in the bag, including the pattern or my notes. If the pattern is digital or from a book, then it's ready to go. For instance, this kit that I'm working on here, based on the color cube card, today I'll cut all the pieces and pack them in a zip bag with a note about what pattern it belongs to from the Jelly Bar book. My puppy got hold of that one. And it's ready to sew when I am. You can see all my tabs in the book. I'm pulling lots of kits today. I'm using the color cards and I'm having a great time. So this week, think about your pattern and how you can prep a ready to sew kit. If you're using remixed geese, it's pretty easy. All the blocks are exactly the same. If you're using a different pattern, you have to examine it and see what you can do to get everything ready for step 1 of sewing. Sometimes a pattern cannot be fully prepped because you have to cut sewn block A to create finished block B or what have you, but you're smart, creative people. I know you'll figure that out. With any pattern, I aim to do as much of the cutting and prep as I possibly can up front. And this is true for borders too. If the quilt has borders or sashing, go ahead and cut them now. Maybe just the long pieces, you don't necessarily subcut, but so they're waiting for you. Borders and sashing are prime places where projects get stalled, but if it's ready and waiting for you, the barrier to entry is almost eliminated and you can just keep sewing. That's it. That's all. This week, get your kit prepped, and next week we'll talk about sewing and pressing and labels. Yes, because you asked, next week I'll talk a bit about labeling your quilts and how I'm going to label this one. Okay, you've done all the prep work and now it's time to sew and press and sew and press and sew. You get it. There's a lot of repetition in quilting. My biggest tip for this part of the process is to do as much as possible entirely before moving to the next step. Let me break down how I sewed this block for remixed geese. I had them cut in sets and I sewed them in sets. This kept me organized and I didn't spend more time sorting it all out later. The sets also gave me a way to mark time, to mark progress, which for me is important. It sort of acts like an automatic treadmill to keep me moving forward and motivated, like little mini goals within the larger goal of the completed quilt. So I first sewed all of wing A to the base triangle, and then I finger pressed that piece back. Note I did not go to the iron at this point. I find just pressing it back is sufficient, and it keeps me from distorting any bias. Plus, I'm not creating another step in the process. Then I sewed all of wing B to the base triangle and finger pressed that back to make the actual pressing easier and less distorting. In any quilt, evaluate your block or block steps and determine if there are steps you can combine or skip altogether. Do you need to press between each seam, or will pressing at the end be enough? So I did that for all the flying geese, all 200 of them, and I piled them on the ironing board ready to press, and then I did. I carefully, working with bias here, pressed all the blocks, keeping them in their sets as I went. Next, I sewed all the sets of geese into pairs and piled them neatly on the ironing surface as I went. Then, once they were sewn into their goosey pairs, I pressed all of those at once, and now they're ready for layout and assembly. From start to finish, I think it took me about 4 hours total for everything. Now, I know not everyone digs working this way because you end up with giant piles of things to process all at one time. That can feel daunting. That's okay. This is what works for me, and you'll find what works for you. Perhaps working in sets of 10 is more manageable for your time or space or mental space constraints. Batching tasks or steps is the key to my working quickly and not getting bogged down by having too many actions in play at the same time. Like sew and press and then sew again and press again. It's a lot. This, of course, is a very simple and straightforward block, and they are all the same, so efficiency is easy. But the process remains the same for any quilt or block, regardless of how complex. Break it down, sew as much as you can before moving on. Next step, continue. For instance, if you're working with a complex block, like one of those fancy Barnstar sampler blocks, like this, or a block with many parts, you can use these steps within each block. This block is filled with half square triangles and square in a squares. Squares in a square? No, one square in many squares. Components. Half square triangles and other components. So you sew all the half square triangles and all the components that you can before moving to the ironing station. Then you press everything you can at once. Then you trim everything you need to all at once and repeat the process. The trick is to do as much of one type of action as possible each step of the way. Some blocks, they require switching tasks between each step, and that's okay. It's going to take longer to make those blocks and to make quilts from those blocks. If you're working toward a deadline, say for a gift for the holidays or a baby on the way, just factor that into your timeline. String piecing is one of these processes. They really need to be pressed between each string addition, but I have a tip for those as well, and I'll share that in a couple of weeks. I'm working on an entire series of string piecing scrap videos. There are places you can speed up and places you need to take extra care about. Determining those places and maximizing your efficiency where you can will make the entire project flow more easily. At the top of the video, I mentioned a bonus project. And in the sewing footage, I'm sure you saw my little square blocks between flying geese sets and steps. These are leader enders, and I learned about them from Bonnie Hunter. How many times have you had to dig a triangle unit out of the sewing machine because it got sucked down into the needle plate? It's a pain, right? It's frustrating, it wrecks your pieces, and it takes time. Eleanor Burns taught me to use what she called, I think it was called a jumper. It doesn't matter. Some call it a thread spider or a thread catcher. A little folded piece of scrap fabric that you stitch through at the beginning and end of a line of chain sewing. It helps prevent your pieces from being chewed up in the needle plate. It's great, effective. I did it for years. Then I found Bonnie Hunter's blog, and Bonnie asked what if and answered it in the most ingenious way. What if I used actual patchwork bits at the beginning and ending of those chain pieces instead of throwaway fabric? Hence, leaders and enders. Bonnie even has 2 books outlining the process. Patterns for quilts that she's made in between piecing for other things. Bonus quilts. Every year in July, Bonnie creates a new Leader Ender Challenge pattern, and it's a sew along, but it doesn't have to be all fancy. It can be anything. I have an abundance of 2-inch squares. Y'all, like seriously. So, where do I put them? So these are always at hand, and I just sew them together. Lights and darks, and eventually those will be sewn into 4 patches, and then those into larger units, all as Leader Ender pieces. It can be strips, it can be those cute little mini charm pack squares that you just can't resist buying at the checkout, but now you have a giant pile of them and don't know what to do. I also have this box of hand-cut tumblers. I was gifted by a bee member. They are wild, let me tell you. And I sewed all of these together, while I was piecing the blocks for Indigo Way. I pieced, I think there were 3 of those per block, and I made 72 blocks, so that's what? 216 tumbler units for basically no effort. If you can't tell, I'm a huge fan of leaders and enders, both for what they give me in helping my pieces not get sucked down into the machine, and bonus quilts. They make great donation quilts. Everything will be linked below, the books, the leaders and enders page, all of it. I promised to talk a bit about labels. I think this spring I will do an entire video about labels and why they matter in historic significance. But today, I'm just going to hit the high points. And the high points are this. Please label your quilt. Just trust me, it's important. For this quilt, I have 1 extra 2-block unit, so I will use that as my label. Labels don't have to be fancy. They do not have to be purchased or even an actual label, but they should be included on your work. Ideally, a label with as much information as possible quilted into the back of your work is preferred. But here, this is what you always want to include in some way. Level 1, made by your full name and the date. Level 2, made for whom, full name, made by, full name, and the date. And then let's go ahead and go level 3. Made for whom, for what occasion, by whom, date, location, full names, guys. Full names. Please don't label your quilt made for Johnny by Mom. That's sweet, and it may mean the world to little Johnny, but it means nothing to anyone else. And I know, I can hear you right now, but I'm not making an heirloom quilt. Guess what? Neither were most of the folks who made the quilts that we have hanging in our museums. The ones that tell our history, but can give no credit to the maker and no context to the work. Your work, your quilts, your art is significant in time, in place, in history, not just to little Johnny who loved his quilt. I use anything permanent to write on labels. The micron pens. I really like the Faber-Castell Pitt pens. It's an India ink pen. I don't have one with me. Sharpie laundry markers. Plain old Sharpie. In fact, more often than not, I write directly onto the back of the quilt. Alright, now don't clutch your pearls. I do this because it won't fall off or be removed, like a stitched on, not in, but on, label can. And if nothing else, I write, made by Amy Dement, 2024, Austin, Texas. If I know who it's for right now, I'll write that in as well. But I can add it later if the quilt becomes a gift. For this quilt, since I'm thinking ahead, I'll press this extra goose unit onto some freezer paper for stability, and then I can write on it why it was made, this breakdown quilt along, my full name, location, and the date. I'll piece it into the backing so that it gets quilted in and becomes a permanent part of the quilt. I'm working right now with a friend who is a quilt historian to come up with a video interview about the significance and importance of labeling your quilts. But that's the gist, guys. And, I'll be honest, I'm not especially good about this. But as I've seen more and more quilts and wondered about the makers and their stories, I'm getting better. Even if I do result to a Sharpie. Okay, I've talked a long time. From here, think about your sewing breakdown. No, not that kind of breakdown. Where can you streamline the process steps by batching actions? I hope you'll try leaders and enders with some basic squares. They make fantastic donation quilts, and I hope you plan now on how you'll label your quilt. It doesn't have to be fancy, I promise. This week, the fun part. Sewing and pressing. And sewing and pressing and sewing. Next week, we get to do layout and assembly, and I've got some tips about color and value placement that I hope you'll find useful. Welcome to Breakdown Quilt Along Week 4. The non-name kind of grew on me. Layout and assembly. It's time to get your pieces laid out and assembled, and this quilt is especially fun in this step because you get to play. Because I rarely make a quilt in the fabric or color scheme that it calls for, I break down layout in 2 steps. Number 1, structure, and number 2, arrangement. The structure of the quilt is the grid or format of how the blocks are laid out. 4x5, 9x11, block A, block B, block C, what have you. And I get this framework in place first as a sort of a rough draft. I don't worry about color or value, I just lay out the structure. In the case of Remixed Geese, it was especially challenging and fun, and as Anna and Toby went through the layout, it sounded like Nintendo cheat codes. Horizontal, up, up, vertical, left, right, vertical, down, down. It was rather entertaining, but really helpful to have 2 people working on it. I just supervised. Arrangement. Like I say, I rarely make a quilt according to pattern, so I spend a great deal of time in step 2, moving and balancing both color and value so that the quilt has flow and balance and no glaring areas of one color or dark corners unless I want them there. Let me show you. Here is the quilt after the structure layout, and I notice a few light areas and some color groupings that I want to move around. Here's what it looks like through a red value lens. It's different, right? You can see why it feels heavy in the lower right corner, even though the colors are bright and varied. And this is not a fancy camera tool. It's this, the Ruby Square Ruler. It's made by Wisecraft Studios, wisecrafthandmade.com. I think I got mine from Missouri Star when she was featured. I'll link several sources in the description box. It's a simple tool and it works really well to separate lightness and darkness of a fabric from the color, which is hard for our brains to do. There is the trick of taking a photo with your phone and flipping it to black and white, and that's quite useful, especially on a design wall where things are staying put for a bit. I like the fact that I can work with the Ruby Ruler in real time and move things on the fly without having to go through the photo process again, especially as you see this one's laid out on the floor and we have a lot of pets, so time is of the essence. Also, there's something about the red filter that's just, it's easier for me to see. But whatever you use, please take notice of how much value plays into the balance of the quilt. Once you see it, you can manipulate it to your advantage. For instance, maybe you want your quilt to range from very light value to very dark to create a landscape effect or an ombre or a gradient. And these are places where value may play more role than color, but both are involved. Or maybe you have a fabric that isn't working and you can't figure out why. It might be a value issue rather than an offending color. In this quilt, I want sparkle and movement. We moved things around. They moved things around. I directed traffic. Checking back with the value finder until we had what we liked. Here. The value was mostly sorted out, but we had an overly pink situation to solve in this corner. Once we liked the arrangement of color and value, we pinned it for assembly. I have them pin vertical rows, top to bottom, left to right, and I number my rows. This goes together very quickly for me, and I don't have to go back to the layout or design wall for placement, and it works when the blocks are all the same size aligned on a grid. If the structure of the quilt were different, the assembly might be as well, and I just adjust accordingly. Then I sew it together using the webbing the top method. And then I press it. If I told you I pressed all the columns before sewing the rows together, I'd be lying. But you probably should do that. I sort of try for evenly pressed seams, but patience is not my forte, and I'm happy with close enough. You press as precisely as it pleases you. Now, if I were sending this out to be quilted, I would be more attentive to the pressing. But I'm quilting it here, so fluffing batting hides a multitude of sins. Since I'm not adding borders, though they would look great, I took a victory lap. Actually, I haven't yet, but I will. And I'll sew about 1/8 of an inch from the edge all the way around. That will keep my seams from stretching too much or popping open during the quilting. And I have my patented sliding quilt system here to show my assembled quilt top. Ooh, careful. Come further in. There we go. Thank you. And I went with the layout as printed in the pattern, partly because I'm demonstrating for the quilt along, but mostly because I like the mixy, playful spirit. Thank you. Feel free to change the layout to one that suits you. It's your quilt. Make it your way, with color and value placement that you love. Next week, I'll break down how I think about, plan for, and execute the actual quilting. Plus, I think I'm changing my original backing plan, so I'll go over that as well. We'll see how it turns out. If you're having fun and or learning something, please click those buttons, like, subscribe, share. It's dangerous territory we're in here, but you planned for this. Don't let your quilt land in the UFO pile. Let's talk quilting and finishing. Hi, I'm Amy and I make things. And in today's video, I'm making my way towards the finish line in the breakdown quilt along. Hang around and I'll show you. You've done all the work. Planning, cutting, sewing, layout and assembly. Don't quit now. Here is where many quilters, myself included sometimes, stop and things end up in UFO land. But you planned ahead. You thought about backing and binding and all those things way back in week 1. And now all you need to do is dig deep and execute the plan. Okay, what are the steps to finishing? Because quilting is only the first step. There's quilting and trimming, binding and labeling if you didn't add one to your backing, photographing and documenting, fancy words for the Instagram post. And then my favorite part, washing the quilt so that it gets all crinkly and full of quilty goodness. We'll just start first things first, the quilting. In this process, you made a backing plan when you planned your quilt, so that's settled and just needs to be prepped. Hopefully, you've thought about the quilting ideas throughout the making process. Are you quilting it on your long arm or domestic machine, or by hand, or sending it out to be quilted? For any of these, there are things you need to consider, like how you want it quilted. Your design, the density of the design, how loosely or tightly you want your quilting pattern packed in. Do you want your quilting pattern to complement, accent, disappear, or is the quilting the feature, like an Angela Walters quilt or a show quilt? Then there's thread. And the same questions here. Do you want it to complement, accent, disappear, or is the thread a feature? For this quilt, being very angular and super colorful and busy, we chose a complementary thread that would mostly blend in, but when it does show, it looks kind of cute. For the quilting pattern, Anna, my long armor, suggested freeform wavy lines, they nicknamed Wibble Wobble, for the quilting, and it gives the quilt movement and ease without being distracting from the fun busy pattern and colors. And they nailed it. Watch them quilt both in real time and in I wish time. I've been doing it for years, and the long arm process still mesmerizes me. Next, there's trimming your quilt. Guys, I don't square my quilts. I just trim them relatively straight and call it good. I do try and process the scraps as I go, even if it's just separating the batting from the fabric. It's just easier to do it now. And then there's binding and labeling. I didn't film the binding process. It was late, and you've seen me bind quilts before. And if you haven't, check out my easiest binding ever video, linked below and in the cards. I've already made my label, and I did forget to add it to the backing before quilting. So now I'll just hand stitch it on, and it'll be just fine. And here is the finished quilt. Okay, it's mostly finished. I've got to hand stitch that label and the binding and get it washed today, but I love it so much. Can you pull it down so everyone can see the top of it just a little? And then out slowly so that they can see the edge. Thank you. I really do need to patent that system. I love it so much. It is bright and cheery and exactly what I imagined it would be. That wraps up the breakdown process quilt along. Planning, kitting and cutting, sewing and piecing, layout and assembly, and finally, quilting and finishing. When the process is broken into discrete steps, I find it easier to manage mentally, keep moving forward, and not get overwhelmed. This is the breakdown process I try to use in all my projects. I'm not always so formal about it. I've been doing it for years, and a lot of it's just automatic. It's just the way I work, and it works for me. I hoped that you learned something about my process and about what might work for you. Do let me know in the comments which parts of the process you might carry forward. I would love the feedback. I would also love any tips or tricks you have in your quilting process. So keep what is useful and forget the rest, but never forget that you make the world more beautiful just by being in it. I'm Amy, and I'll see you next time.